I'm a 31-year-old man, and 5 years ago, my father and I went through one of the worst arguments I could imagine. He'd always been set on me joining the family business, thinking it was my only path. For years, that was the plan. But by the time I hit my mid-20s, I knew it wasn't for me. I wanted to make it on my own, something different. He didn't take it well, at all. We fought, things were said, and by the end of it, he told me I was no longer welcome in his life. It was a harsh cut, but I threw myself into a career I'm passionate about. I've since built a stable, successful life. I worked my way up in a field I love, met a great group of friends, and honestly thought I'd left that chapter behind. We hadn't spoken since he disowned me, and I figured it would stay that way. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from him. After years of silence, his first words to me were a simple, "We need to talk." It didn't sound like a casual check-in. It was direct, no warmth or apology. I stared at the message for a while, feeling a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Part of me wondered if he'd had some kind of change of heart. Maybe he'd realized he'd been too harsh? Maybe this was his way of reaching out for a genuine reconciliation? I thought about ignoring it, but something in me decided to hear him out. I replied, asking him what he wanted to discuss, but he wouldn't tell me anything specific. He just kept saying it was important family matters. This only added to my curiosity. My mother, who divorced my father years ago, had warned me that he'd been having issues with his business. Apparently, it wasn't doing well and things had been rough for him lately. But she didn't go into detail, and I didn't press her on it. After a couple of days going back and forth in my head, I decided I'd meet him, but I set a few boundaries. I made it clear to myself that if I was going, I wouldn't let him manipulate me. I just wanted to get through the meeting, figure out what he wanted, and then decide my next step. When we finally met, the first thing he did was launch into a monologue about how the business was struggling. He didn't waste any time. He explained how things had gone downhill in recent years, and now he was on the verge of losing it all. It was almost surreal, watching this man, who had always been so strong, so in control, sit there and admit that he was in trouble. But the kicker? He wanted me to help him save it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man who'd cut me out of his life over a difference in career choices was now asking me to step in and rescue him. It felt like some kind of twisted joke. I sat there in silence, just absorbing it all. He went on, saying how family should stick together and blood is thicker than water. Then he threw out the idea of making me a partner if I helped him turn things around. It was clear he was trying to appeal to some sense of family loyalty, but all I could think about was the fact that he hadn't shown me any loyalty when he disowned me. He even tried to offer a sort of apology, saying that he'd done what he thought was best for the family. It was barely an apology, more of an excuse for his behavior. Listening to him talk like that just stirred up all the anger I'd pushed down over the years. It felt like he was only coming to me now because he had no one else. He wasn't here to make amends or acknowledge the pain he'd caused. He just needed someone with money and skills, and I happened to fit the bill. That realization hit hard. By the end of the conversation, I told him I'd think about it, just to get out of there. As soon as I left, though, I knew I needed perspective. My friends had their opinions, but they'd never been through anything like this. That's when I decided to turn to Reddit. I needed an outside perspective, someone who wasn't personally involved, who could see the situation objectively. I made a post, laying everything out. I explained the whole backstory, how he'd disowned me, the sudden message out of the blue, the revelation about his struggling business, and his attempt to reel me in with guilt and promises of partnership. I asked if anyone thought I owed him anything after what he'd done, or if I was wrong for feeling like he only cared now because he was desperate. The responses poured in faster than I expected. Some people couldn't believe he'd even have the nerve to reach out after cutting me off so coldly. Others encouraged me to hear him out but warned me to set boundaries. A few pointed out that he'd shown his true colors, and I should walk away for my own peace of mind. Now I'm here, weighing my options. There's a part of me that wonders if I'd regret it someday if I just walked away without trying. But the anger, the hurt, that's not something I can just overlook. I'm not sure where this is going yet, but the advice from Reddit has been invaluable. Update 1. Not long after I posted on Reddit, things started heating up. My aunt called me out of the blue, saying my father had no choice but to reach out to me. She kept reminding me how family is supposed to support each other, especially in tough times. She went on about how I was the only one who could help keep the family's legacy alive. The guilt tripping was obvious, but it wasn't easy to ignore, even after everything that happened. Then, my mom weighed in. She's been divorced from my dad for years, so she has no loyalty to him, but she knows how he operates. She warned me to stay out of it. "You've done enough for him," she said, reminding me of how he treated me after I chose a different career path. She believed he'd drag me down without any real consideration for what I'd be risking. A few days later, a file arrived from my father with all the financials for the business. The numbers were staggering: piles of debt, unpaid loans, and a massive monthly deficit that I knew would be almost impossible to cover. As I went through the documents, I came across something odd, an entry referring to a silent partner. This wasn't someone I'd ever heard of, yet apparently they'd been bailing my father out of financial trouble for years. This was more than a struggling business, it was a sinking ship that someone else had already been trying to keep afloat. My father followed up with a call, hinting that if I stepped in now, the business would eventually be mine. He dangled the idea of inheritance in front of me, claiming that it was all meant for me to take over someday. I couldn't help but doubt his sincerity. He'd disowned me over my choices, and now he expected me to believe he'd always planned to leave it all to me. Meanwhile, cousins and other relatives began reaching out. Some were sympathetic, saying they understood how much he'd put me through, while others were quick to call me cold-hearted for even considering turning him down. It felt like everyone had an opinion, and each one seemed to add another layer to the pressure building around me. The family's reputation was apparently on the line, and I was the one holding the decision that could either save or ruin it. To make sense of it all, I booked a session with a therapist. I hadn't talked much about my dad in therapy before, but now it was all I could think about. The therapist encouraged me to set boundaries and reminded me that it was okay to protect myself emotionally, especially given the way he treated me in the past. While processing all this, memories of the night he disowned me came flooding back. I'd spent years trying to gain his approval, helping him with the business whenever he needed an extra set of hands or someone to run errands. But when I told him I wanted to pursue a different career, he shut me out without a second thought. I'd been there for him so many times before, both financially and professionally. Thinking back on it only made me more resentful. When I did a deeper dive into the financials, it became clear that this wasn't just a simple bailout. This business needed a complete overhaul. It wasn't a case of pouring in some cash to keep it running. The entire structure was flawed, and if I got involved, I'd have to change everything from the ground up. It felt like I'd be signing up to fix years of bad decisions, all while risking my own stability. Then, he left me a voicemail. In a voice I barely recognized, he sounded almost broken, talking about how he was at the end of his rope and didn't know who else to turn to. It was strange hearing him sound so vulnerable, and for a second, it nearly worked. But the voice in my head reminded me of all the times he'd used guilt and manipulation before. Just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, my younger sibling reached out. They'd mostly stayed out of the family drama, but now they admitted that they, too, felt trapped by my father's expectations. They resented him, but felt like they couldn't say no because of the pressure to keep up the family's appearance. They hinted they might even understand if I chose to walk away, but they weren't sure they'd be brave enough to do the same. I vented to one of my close friends about the whole mess. They suggested I consider helping, but only if I could lay out strict terms that would protect me. They warned me that my father might try to reel me in emotionally, and it was clear they thought I should stay cautious if I did decide to get involved. By this point, my family was completely divided. Some were rooting for me to step in and do what's right for the family, while others respected my need to prioritize my own life. My aunt even went as far as hinting that if I didn't help, it would be a shameful mark on the family, a sign that I'd let my father and the legacy down. After all the back and forth, I decided I'd at least look into what helping might look like. But I wasn't about to jump in blindly. I needed conditions, serious ones, that would ensure I wasn't walking into a trap. With everything that was happening, I decided to keep Reddit updated on the situation. The support and advice I'd been getting from strangers had been grounding in a way I hadn't expected, and I knew I'd need all the perspective I could get in the days ahead. Update 2. After the endless calls, guilt trips, and mixed advice from family, I decided I needed to see the business myself. It had been years since I'd set foot there, and I barely recognized the place when I walked in. The building looked tired, like it hadn't been properly maintained in ages. The walls were scuffed, fixtures outdated, and even the reception area seemed neglected. For a business that was supposed to be our family's legacy, it looked like it had been on autopilot for a long time. While I was there, a few of the employees approached me privately. One by one, they shared stories of how the management had been inconsistent, budgets slashed, and key staff leaving for competitors. They hinted they'd be relieved if someone new took over. I got the impression they'd been holding on to the hope that things would improve, but the way they spoke showed they'd nearly lost faith. A few of them even outright said that they'd welcome new leadership. During the visit, I found out that my father's health had taken a hit too. Apparently, he'd been dealing with a lot of stress-related issues, enough to cause him to see a doctor regularly. It was a new angle I hadn't considered before, and it started making sense why he was reaching out now. He was in over his head, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it outright. Toward the end of the visit, I was introduced to the silent partner mentioned in the financials. This was someone who'd been working with my father for years, a person who knew the ins and outs of the business and had watched it deteriorate under my father's watch. This partner didn't hold back in expressing frustration with my father's decisions and hinted that they'd support me stepping in. The partner even suggested a potential partnership if I agreed to help, making it clear that they, too, were done dealing with my father's mismanagement. When I brought up the idea of taking full control, though, my father wasn't having it. He danced around the subject, talking about how he wanted me involved but still needed to guide the company. I could tell he wasn't ready to give up his authority, even though it was clear he was the one holding the business back. Back home, the family noise continued. Relatives began talking about our family's reputation, implying that it would be tarnished if I didn't step up. The subtle and not-so-subtle jabs made it clear that some of them saw me as the only hope to salvage our family name. Everywhere I turned, someone was shaming me, accusing me of being ungrateful for not rushing to help. My sibling added another layer of tension. Out of nowhere, they called me up, accusing me of abandoning the family. They felt I was turning my back on all of them and putting my own pride above the family's needs. It was an exhausting conversation, stirring up old dynamics and old arguments. I could feel the pressure mounting, as if everyone around me expected me to ignore everything from the past and just do the right thing. After a few days of thinking things over, the silent partner reached out to me privately. They hinted that they'd be willing to back me if I could convince my father to step down entirely. They were tired of the constant losses, and they could see the business was in a tailspin. It was a tempting offer, and I found myself weighing the possibilities. But then my father set an ultimatum. He gave me a deadline, telling me I had to make a decision soon. He kept talking about the legacy, using it like a badge of honor. Every word felt loaded, like he was counting on my sense of family duty to override the resentment I'd carried for years. When I confided in my friends, they weren't thrilled about the pressure I was under. They reminded me to take care of myself, pointing out that family loyalty shouldn't come at the cost of my well-being. Some of them even suggested I walk away entirely if it meant protecting my mental and emotional health. They knew my history with my father and saw this for what it was, another attempt to control and guilt-trip me. Meanwhile, the responses on Reddit flooded in. Hundreds of commenters weighed in, and the majority were on my side. They warned me to be careful, reminding me to protect myself and set boundaries. Many of them shared stories of their own family struggles, and reading those experiences gave me some reassurance. They saw through the manipulation tactics and echoed what my friends had said. Don't let myself be pulled into something that could ruin my peace of mind. In my next therapy session, I shared everything that had been happening. My therapist encouraged me to stand firm and reminded me that setting clear terms wasn't just fair, it was necessary. She urged me not to let guilt dictate my choices and to create conditions that would protect me from being dragged into the family chaos. With all this input, I started to see a path forward. I realized that if I were to get involved, it couldn't be under my father's terms. I couldn't step in just to prop up his ego or clean up his mess without any authority. If I was going to help, it had to be with full control. So I decided to draft a contract. It included terms to protect my autonomy, giving me authority over all major decisions. I wasn't about to get sucked into the chaos without making sure I had control over what I was stepping into. After everything, it felt like the only way I could be involved without compromising myself. I handed him the contract and told him it was non-negotiable. Now, all that's left is to see if he'll accept it, or if he'll let his pride stand in the way once again. For now, I've updated Reddit on the latest developments, and I'm waiting to see how this all unfolds. Update 3. The day after I handed my father the contract, I got his response. He rejected it outright, saying he couldn't allow me to take full control of the business. He insisted he needed to stay involved to preserve what he'd built. He wasn't willing to let go, even if it meant losing his last shot at saving the business. It was almost laughable. He was clinging to authority while his entire legacy crumbled around him. Not long after, word started spreading through the family that I'd supposedly tried to strong-arm him into giving up his life's work. Some relatives weren't shy about voicing their opinions, calling me disrespectful, selfish, and accusing me of turning my back on my own father. It became a full-blown family feud, with messages and calls coming in from all directions. I could sense some of them didn't even know the full story, but they were more than ready to paint me as the villain. Seeing this all unfold, I went back to my father and made my position clear. I wasn't stepping in unless I had complete control. I told him this was non-negotiable. If he wanted my help, he'd have to let me take charge without interference. My terms were set, and I wasn't about to bend no matter how much backlash came my way. But that didn't stop him from trying. Soon, he started showing up unannounced, almost as if he was trying to guilt me into changing my mind. Each time he came by, he'd make these comments about how families shouldn't abandon each other, acting as if I was the one who'd done him wrong. He'd talk about how he was getting old and didn't want to be left alone. It was like he was trying every tactic he could think of to pull at my emotions and make me feel guilty. In the middle of this, my sibling got involved again. They were upset, claiming the feud was tearing the family apart and blaming me for making things worse. They said I was being stubborn and putting the family legacy at risk just to prove a point. The conversation got heated, and the family tension that had always simmered beneath the surface started boiling over. Despite the pressure from my sibling, I held my ground. I knew getting pulled back into my father's influence wouldn't end well. I had to look out for my own well-being, and this wasn't the time to cave just because everyone around me thought they knew what was best. Finally, after days of back and forth, my father made a new offer. He said he'd agree to step down mostly. He wanted to stay on as a consultant, a way for him to keep some influence in the business while letting me take over. It was clear he wasn't ready to fully let go, but he was trying to find some middle ground. I could see he was reluctant, almost bitter, but this was as close as he was going to get to compromising. After thinking it over, I reluctantly agreed to the terms. The contract gave me control over the operations, while he would technically stay on as a consultant. I hoped this would finally put an end to the drama and bring some peace to the family. We signed the agreement, and for a brief moment, it felt like I'd found a way forward. But of course it didn't last. Even with the agreement in place, my father kept testing boundaries. I'd get texts and voicemails from him, subtly and not so subtly suggesting changes, questioning my decisions, or reminding me about the importance of certain business practices he'd always valued. It felt like he was constantly looking over my shoulder, trying to find ways to insert himself back into the decision-making process. At the same time, the silent partner reached out to warn me of new challenges on the horizon. They mentioned some recent issues with suppliers and hinted at potential legal trouble due to debts and past mismanagement. It was clear the business was a mess, and I had a mountain of work ahead of me to keep it from going under. The silent partner's warnings only added to the urgency, pushing me to take the reins quickly and cut down on any lingering interference. With the business hanging by a thread, my relatives continued to stir the pot. Some were bitter that I hadn't just taken the reins without conditions, claiming I'd betrayed the family by insisting on control. I even heard rumors that certain family members thought I was only in it for personal gain. It was ridiculous, considering I was putting my own time and money on the line, but that didn't seem to matter to them. My father kept the guilt trips coming, too. I received another voicemail, this time with him practically pleading, saying I'd ruined the family's name by forcing him to step down. He sounded defeated, almost like he was putting on a show for sympathy. It would have been easy to feel bad, but I knew this was just another attempt to manipulate me. Then, the silent partner dropped another bombshell. They discovered that there were still unresolved legal issues from my father's management days. Apparently, he'd cut some corners and left a trail of debt that could potentially come back to haunt the business. It wasn't just a matter of paying off bills. There were legal implications that could affect me if I didn't handle them properly. This was a complication I hadn't planned for, and I realized I'd have to tread carefully to avoid getting dragged into his past mistakes. I shared this latest development on Reddit, and as expected, the reactions were mixed. Some people understood why I'd chosen to take the reins, saying it was smart to protect myself by setting conditions. Others questioned the compromise, suggesting I'd just open the door for more trouble by allowing him to stay involved as a consultant. The feedback was a reminder that this wasn't going to be easy, and there were plenty of people who saw both sides of the struggle. As I continued to navigate the fallout, my resolve only strengthened. I knew now, more than ever, that I couldn't let family obligations push me into sacrificing my future. The business was in rough shape, the family was divided, and my father's manipulations hadn't stopped. But I was determined to see this through on my terms, no matter how many obstacles came my way. Update 4. Just when I thought things were finally under control, my father threw another curveball. He reached out, demanding a bigger role in the business than what we'd agreed on in the contract. It was clear he hadn't let go of his need for control. He wanted more authority, more say in how things were done, and he acted like our agreement didn't mean anything. I could see it for what it was. He was trying to sabotage any progress I'd made, using his demands to keep his grip on the business, no matter the cost. Then, I got a call from the silent partner. They'd picked up on something suspicious and warned me that my father had been making side deals behind the scenes. According to them, he'd been hiding certain debts and playing around with funds in ways that could harm the business long term. This was the last thing I needed. He was deliberately keeping information from me, all while expecting me to clean up his mess without question. I spent the next few days combing through the business financials, going over every detail. Sure enough, there were strange transactions, hidden accounts, unexplained expenses, and debts that hadn't been disclosed. It was like he'd left a trail of breadcrumbs, hoping I wouldn't look too closely. Seeing this, I started to doubt everything he'd told me about the state of the business. It wasn't just struggling, it was being actively drained by someone who didn't want to lose control. Then, my sibling reached out, finally revealing something they'd kept quiet about. They admitted they'd known about my father's reckless spending and shady dealings for years, but never felt they could speak up. They didn't want to go against the family and risk the fallout, so they'd kept it to themselves. Hearing this, I realized my father's behavior was even more deeply rooted than I'd thought, and he'd been playing this game for a long time. I couldn't hold back any longer. I went straight to my father and confronted him about the hidden accounts and secret deals. He didn't deny it outright, but he deflected, saying it was complicated and claiming he'd been managing things his way. It was like he thought he could smooth talk his way out of it. But this time, I wasn't letting it slide. I gave him an ultimatum. Either he came clean about every financial detail, or I was walking away for good. He finally, begrudgingly, agreed to show me everything, but it was obvious he resented me for even asking. It was the first time I'd seen him truly cornered, and he didn't like it one bit. As we went through the records, more and more debts surfaced. It turned out the business owed far more than he'd ever let on, and he'd been borrowing under the table to keep things afloat. It wasn't just a bad situation, it was a ticking time bomb. My heart sank when a lawyer reached out to me, explaining that some of these unpaid debts were tied to the family name. If I stayed involved, I could be liable, which meant his mess was about to become my problem if I didn't cut ties soon. Meanwhile, word got around the family that I was uncovering all these issues, and some of them didn't take it well. Suddenly, I was accused of airing dirty laundry and bringing shame to the family. They'd rather see me quietly handle things, no matter how bad they were, just to protect the family's reputation. It was infuriating to be blamed for simply trying to find out the truth about the business I was supposed to take over. Seeing how deep my father's deception went, the silent partner came forward with a new offer. They suggested that I take over fully, with backing from outside investors to cover the debt. This way, I could buy out my father's share and the remaining debts, cutting him out entirely. It was a tempting solution, but I knew it would spark even more drama. I'd be seen as betraying my father to outsiders, even though it was his own mismanagement that put us here. When I brought up the idea to my father, he refused to acknowledge any of his mistakes. He blamed me, saying I was the one ruining the family's legacy, that I was the problem here. He wouldn't admit to any wrongdoing, instead acting as if I'd betrayed him by trying to take over what he'd built. It was unbelievable, watching him twist the situation, completely blind to the damage he'd caused. All of this started taking a toll. I could feel the weight of it, my father's manipulation, the family's judgment, the financial chaos, and the never-ending pressure. In my next therapy session, my therapist looked me in the eye and told me it was time to set boundaries, for real. She urged me to consider walking away, reminding me that my mental health was at stake. She didn't mince words. It was clear that staying in this mess was only going to drag me down further. The breaking point came when my father left me a voicemail. This time, he tried to guilt-trip me by bringing up childhood memories, talking about family traditions, and reminding me of how he'd always done everything for the family. It was a last-ditch effort to pull me back in, playing on nostalgia and hoping I'd cave. But this time, I didn't. I realized I'd reached my limit. I couldn't keep putting myself through this for a business that was beyond saving and a family that refused to see reason. I informed my father, the silent partner, and the rest of the family that I was done. I wouldn't be dragged into their drama, guilted into debt, or used as a pawn in a broken legacy. I posted my final decision on Reddit, sharing how I'd tried everything to make it work, only to face sabotage, secrets, and manipulation at every turn. The responses were a mix of support and relief, with people encouraging me to protect myself and let go. For the first time, I felt a sense of freedom, knowing I'd made the right choice for my own sanity. And with that, I walked away, leaving my father and the family legacy behind. Update 5. Walking away was supposed to be the end of it, but my family had other ideas. Almost immediately after I announced my decision, my phone started blowing up. Messages from family members poured in, each one angrier than the last. They accused me of selfishness, of abandoning the family when they needed me most. A few even called me ungrateful, claiming I was disrespecting everything my father had worked so hard to build. It was relentless, and it didn't take long for the news to spread beyond family circles. My father took things a step further. He went on social media, posting about how his own child had betrayed him and let the family legacy fall apart. He framed it as if I'd left him high and dry without any warning, painting himself as the victim of my cold-hearted decision. Family, friends, and extended relatives started chiming in, and some even shared his post, which only stirred up more drama. It was clear he was trying to rally everyone against me, hoping public pressure would force me to change my mind. But thankfully, I wasn't alone. My friends came through, sending messages of support and reminding me why I'd made the choice to step away. I also received tons of messages from Reddit, with people sharing their own stories of family manipulation and urging me to protect my boundaries. The outpouring of support made it easier to tune out the noise from my family. Their words helped me see that I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was just standing up for myself. Then, out of nowhere, a job opportunity landed in my inbox. It was for a high-paying position in a field I was genuinely passionate about, with more stability than I'd had in years. The timing couldn't have been better. It felt like a sign that I'd made the right decision. This was the kind of chance I could focus on without the constant stress of family drama looming over me. I accepted the offer, eager to start fresh and throw myself into something I actually cared about. Around this time, a few relatives reached out privately, admitting they'd always understood my side but hadn't spoken up because of family pressure. They apologized for not standing by me publicly and admitted they respected my decision to set boundaries. It was a relief to know I wasn't completely alone in my family, even if they hadn't openly supported me before. News eventually filtered back to me that my father's business was still in freefall. The silent partner had finally had enough and pulled out completely, leaving my father without any financial safety net. Creditors were closing in, demanding payments he couldn't cover, and there was talk of the business being forced to shut down. Part of me had expected this outcome, but hearing it confirmed made it all real. My father was now facing the consequences of his choices without me there to bail him out. As the dust settled, I started feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I didn't have the weight of family expectations hanging over me. I wasn't worrying about being guilted into things I didn't want to do or trying to please people who only seemed to care when they needed something from me. I felt free, like I could finally live my life on my own terms. Therapy had been a huge part of getting to this point. Looking back, I realized that setting boundaries had given me the strength to break free from the toxic family dynamics that had ruled my life for so long. I'd spent years bending over backward to keep the peace, and it was only now, after walking away, that I could see how much that had cost me. Talking it through with my therapist helped me process the entire ordeal and learn how to protect my mental health going forward. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a ripple effect of positive changes. My stress levels dropped, I started sleeping better, and I found myself enjoying everyday things in a way I hadn't for years. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with and put more time into hobbies I loved. Without the constant family drama, life felt lighter, more manageable. Then, just when I thought it was finally over, my father made one last attempt to pull me back in. He reached out with an apology saying he'd been wrong and admitting he needed my help. He begged for financial support, insisting he'd learn from his mistakes. But by this point, I'd seen enough to know this was just another cycle of manipulation. I turned him down, choosing to let go of the guilt he'd used to keep me close for so many years. I realized that setting boundaries wasn't just about saying no, it was about taking control of my life and refusing to let family guilt define my choices. I promised myself that I wouldn't let anyone, not even family, push me into sacrificing my well-being again. It was liberating to know I could stand firm and protect my peace. To close this chapter for good, I posted a final update on social media, thanking my friends and supporters and explaining my decision. I wanted people to hear my side of the story and understand that my choice wasn't made lightly. I wasn't betraying anyone, I was just choosing to live a healthier, happier life. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and for the first time I felt like I could finally put it all behind me. My younger sibling reached out after that post, quietly admitting they respected what I'd done. They said they wished they had the courage to do the same but felt trapped by the family's expectations. It was bittersweet to hear, but it reminded me that everyone has to find their own way. I'd made my choice, and now it was up to them to make theirs. In the end, I accepted that I'd done everything I could. I couldn't change my father or undo the past, but I could move forward. Walking away from the family business and all the drama that came with it was the best decision I'd ever made. I'm ready to embrace the future, finally free from the weight of family obligations that never felt right. And with that, I close this chapter, grateful for the peace I'd found and excited for the life ahead. Hey everyone, I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I've been working at my dad's auto repair shop since I was 16. It's not the kind of place you see in flashy ads or on TV shows about cars. It's just a modest but steady business that's served our small town for decades. Over the years, I've put my sweat and soul into it, learning every part of the trade from my dad. For a long time, I thought the shop would eventually be mine. Growing up, my dad would talk about how proud he was of the work I was putting in and how he saw a lot of himself in me. One day, this will all be yours, he'd say, usually while pointing out some issue on a beat-up old truck we were fixing. Those words stuck with me. They were my motivation through the late nights, the long hours, and the weekends spent at the shop while my friends were out having fun. My older brother, on the other hand, has always had a different path. He's 32 now, and he's more into the tech world. He spent most of his adult life working on startups, chasing funding, and pitching app ideas. I don't think he's ever picked up a wrench in his life. To be honest, he's never shown any interest in the family business, and that's always been fine with me. He had his thing, I had mine. But recently, things have felt off. My dad's been talking about retiring sooner than expected. He's not sick or anything serious, but he's been hinting at wanting to slow down and enjoy life. It seemed like the perfect time for me to step up and take over. I even started making mental notes of what I'd change once I was in charge. Maybe update some of the equipment, expand our services, stuff like that. Then, I started noticing subtle shifts. My dad began spending more time with my brother. At first, I thought it was just family stuff. They've always been close in that way. But then, one of my coworkers mentioned something that stopped me in my tracks. My brother had been coming around the shop, asking questions about how things ran. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe he was just curious. But things got weirder. At a family dinner not too long ago, my dad started going on about how impressed he was with my brother's business acumen. He didn't say much more than that, but the way he looked at him during the conversation made my stomach sink. I asked my dad if something was going on, and he waved me off with a casual, "Don't worry about it. Everything's fine." A few days later, I walked into the shop like usual, but something was definitely not normal. My brother was there, standing in the middle of the shop with some accountant-looking guy, talking about plans to rebrand. Rebrand? The shop? My shop? I didn't even know what to say. I just froze there, listening as they threw around ideas like renaming the place and turning it into some kind of sleek, modernized repair chain. I confronted my dad later that day, trying to keep my cool. That's when he dropped the bomb. He decided to hand the shop over to my brother. He said it was for the best, and that my brother's business skills would take the place to new heights. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded him of all the years I'd put into the shop, but he just brushed it off, saying I'd always have a role there, maybe as a manager. My brother's reaction made it worse. He acted like it was no big deal and even joked about how I'd be running the day-to-day stuff while he handled the important business decisions. I couldn't tell if he was clueless or just didn't care how much this was hurting me. When I talked to my mom about it, she admitted she thought the decision was unfair, but said she didn't want to get involved. She didn't want to cause a bigger divide in the family. That didn't help. I started to wonder if I had any legal ground to stand on. I mean, I've put in over a decade of work here. I wasn't just some employee clocking in and out. I've helped build this business. I spent the rest of that night scrolling Reddit, reading posts from people who'd been in similar situations. It was comforting in a way, but also infuriating. A lot of people seemed to think I might have a case, but others said it wasn't worth the fight if it would destroy my relationship with my family. I don't know. I feel stuck. Right now, I just need to figure out what my next move is. Do I let this go and accept whatever scraps they throw my way, or do I stand up for myself and risk losing everything? For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, but I've got a sinking feeling this is just the beginning of a much bigger battle. Update 1. After my last post, the response was overwhelming. Most people told me to fight for my rights and not let my dad and brother push me out of something I've dedicated over a decade of my life to. Some shared similar experiences, while others pointed out legal options I might not have thought about. It was a mix of support and practical advice that helped me see I wasn't crazy for feeling betrayed. Encouraged by those comments, I decided it was time to confront my dad directly. I waited until things were calm at home and asked to sit down with him. I started by laying out everything I'd done for the shop, from the late nights to bringing in some of our biggest customers. I didn't raise my voice or get emotional, I just presented the facts. But when I finished, he didn't look guilty or regretful. He just sighed and said he was doing this because he thought it was the right decision for the family. He went on about how I'd always have a secure job at the shop and how my brother needed the stability because his tech ventures hadn't worked out. That part stung. I've worked my tail off for years, and my reward is a job under someone who hasn't even been involved in the business until now. It felt like my brother's failures were being used to justify taking something I'd earned. When I pressed him further, he got defensive, saying it wasn't personal and that I should trust him to make the best decision for everyone. Things took an uglier turn a few days later. I was in the break room at the shop, and I overheard my brother talking to someone on the phone. He was laughing, saying I was too emotional to run a business, and that this was just how things were. That one sentence felt like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just indifferent, he thought this whole situation was funny. By this point, I knew I had to figure out where I stood legally. I reached out to a local lawyer for advice. After explaining the situation, they told me that while I didn't technically own the business, the years I'd spent helping it grow and my contributions to its success might give me a case for compensation. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. Meanwhile, my mom, who initially seemed like she didn't want to take sides, started showing more support. She told me she didn't agree with my dad's decision and thought I should stand up for myself. She even tried to talk to him privately, but it didn't seem to change his mind. My coworkers also had my back. When I told them what was happening, they were just as angry as I was. A couple of them even said they'd quit if my brother took over, especially since he had no experience in the industry. Hearing that gave me a boost of confidence. I wasn't the only one who thought this whole thing was unfair. Then came the family dinner. I wasn't planning to bring it up, but when my dad started talking about the exciting changes coming to the shop, I couldn't hold back. I called him out in front of everyone, asking why he thought it was okay to make promises to me for years, only to hand everything to my brother. My dad tried to brush it off, saying I was overreacting, but I didn't let up. My brother chimed in, saying I didn't understand the big picture and that I was being entitled. That was when I lost it. I told them both they were lying and manipulating me, and then I walked out. The next day, my lawyer suggested we take the first formal step, sending a letter outlining my contributions and demanding compensation for the years I'd worked without a formal agreement. It wasn't about money, it was about making it clear that I wouldn't just roll over and let them do this to me. My brother must have gotten wind of the letter because he texted me a few days later. He offered to make me a partner in the new setup, which based on his tone, sounded like a glorified management role with no real say in how things were run. I didn't even respond. I wasn't going to settle for scraps when I'd been promised the whole thing. The fallout didn't stop there. Word started spreading among extended family, and suddenly everyone had an opinion. Most people sided with me, saying my dad was out of line for breaking his promise. A few tried to play peacemaker, but it felt like the damage was already done. I posted an update on Reddit, sharing everything that had happened since the first post. I asked for advice on whether to keep pushing legally or if I should just walk away and cut ties with my family. The responses were just as supportive as before, with many encouraging me to keep fighting but warning me to prepare for the fallout. Right now, I'm trying to take things one step at a time. The next move is probably going to court, but I'll keep you all updated as things unfold. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Update 2. After my last update, things escalated faster than I expected. Encouraged by the support from Reddit and my coworkers, I officially filed a legal claim against my dad for unpaid labor and emotional damages. It wasn't an easy decision, but I felt like I had no other choice. My lawyer assured me that I had a strong case, especially given the years of work I'd put into the business without a formal contract. When my dad found out about the lawsuit, he completely lost it. He started calling me ungrateful and accusing me of trying to destroy the family. He said I was overreacting and should have just accepted the situation like an adult. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. I didn't engage with him directly after that. My lawyer advised me to let all communication go through them, and I agreed. Surprisingly, my brother went radio silent during all of this. After the text about the so-called partnership, he didn't reach out again. I wasn't sure if he was staying quiet because he didn't want to get involved, or if he was just letting my dad take the heat. Either way, I wasn't complaining. Meanwhile, my coworkers stepped up in a big way. Several of them agreed to testify about how much I'd contributed to the shop over the years. One even mentioned that they remembered my dad publicly saying multiple times that I'd inherit the business one day. Having their support meant everything. It felt like validation for all the hard work I'd put in. As part of the legal process, my lawyer and I started digging through my old emails and documents to build a solid case. That's when I struck gold. I found emails from a few years ago where I'd been the main point of contact for securing some of our biggest clients. These weren't small deals either, they were contracts that brought in steady work and revenue for the shop. The emails clearly showed that I wasn't just another employee, I was an integral part of the business's success. My mom, who had been hesitant at first, started taking a stronger stand. She told my dad she wouldn't just sit by and let him treat me this way. In one heated argument, she even threatened to leave him if he didn't at least try to make amends. That was a turning point. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in the fight within my family. In the midst of all this, my extended family got involved. Someone decided it was a good idea to organize a family meeting to mediate the situation. I reluctantly agreed to attend, hoping it might lead to some sort of resolution. Spoiler, it didn't. The meeting quickly turned into a shouting match. My dad accused me of airing dirty laundry and disrespecting him. My brother jumped in, saying I was being selfish and couldn't see the bigger picture. I countered by laying out everything I'd done for the business and pointing out how my dad had broken his promise. It ended with my dad giving me an ultimatum: drop the legal claim or be cut off from the family. I left the meeting without looking back. As word spread around town about the lawsuit, I started noticing a shift in how people treated me. A lot of locals, especially our longtime clients, sided with me. They knew how much time I'd spent at the shop and how invested I was in its success. Some even told me they'd stop bringing their cars there if my brother stayed in charge. It was bittersweet to hear, but it showed me I wasn't alone. Then I learned something that put things into perspective. One of my cousins, who's closer to my brother than I am, let it slip that his tech ventures had been failing for years. Apparently he was deep in debt, and taking over the shop was supposed to be his lifeline. That explained a lot about my dad's decision. It didn't make it right, but it helped me understand why he'd thrown me under the bus. Eventually, the case moved forward, and a court date was set. My dad must have realized how serious I was because he tried to settle out of court. The offer was laughable, barely enough to cover a year's worth of my work, let alone the decade I'd put in. I rejected it without hesitation. The tension within the family kept building. Relatives started pressuring my dad to make things right with me. They pointed out how unfair he'd been and how much damage this was causing to our relationships. Some even stopped speaking to him altogether. It was chaos, but I stayed focused on the case. I updated Reddit with everything that had happened so far. The support and encouragement kept me going. People shared stories about similar fights they'd been through and told me I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself. I don't know what the outcome will be, but one thing's for sure, I'm not backing down. The court date is set, and I'll keep you all posted as things progress. This fight isn't over yet. Update 3. The court date finally arrived, and walking into that courtroom felt surreal. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I had my lawyer by my side, along with a few of my coworkers who had agreed to testify. The courtroom wasn't packed, but I noticed a few familiar faces from the community who had come to show their support. My mom was there too, sitting quietly in the back. My dad and brother were on the other side of the room, avoiding eye contact with me. The proceedings started with opening statements. My lawyer laid out the case, years of unpaid labor, verbal promises made by my dad, and my significant contributions to the success of the business. My dad's lawyer argued that I was just an employee and that my dad had the right to give the business to whoever he wanted. It was hard not to react, but I stayed calm. Then came the testimonies. My brother was the first to take the stand. He claimed the decision to give him the business was purely financial, painting himself as the more capable person to modernize and expand the shop. He downplayed my role, saying I'd been there just doing routine work and wasn't involved in any major business decisions. Hearing him talk like that was infuriating, but it wasn't unexpected. Next, it was time for my coworkers to testify. One by one, they described the reality of what went on at the shop. They talked about how I was the one who handled client negotiations, managed the day-to-day operations, and even trained new employees. One coworker, who'd been with the shop for almost as long as I had, mentioned that my dad often referred to me as his right-hand man and talked about handing the shop over to me someday. Their words painted a clear picture of how much I'd contributed, and it felt like the tide was turning in my favor. When it was my dad's turn to testify, he stuck to the argument that I was just an employee. He said he'd never formally promised the shop to me, and that any discussions about it were just casual conversations. He seemed nervous, stumbling over his words at times, especially when questioned about why he never put anything in writing. My lawyer pressed him on why my brother, who had no experience in the industry, was suddenly the best choice to run the business. My dad tried to justify it by saying he believed in my brother's business skills, but the reasoning felt weak. Then it was my turn. I presented the emails and documents my lawyer and I had gathered, showing how I'd been instrumental in bringing in major clients and ensuring the shop's success. The judge seemed to pay close attention as I explained my role, using specific examples of deals I'd negotiated and problems I'd solved. My lawyer asked me to talk about the conversations I'd had with my dad over the years, where he'd promised the shop would be mine. I answered honestly, laying out the timeline and details. The most unexpected moment came when my mom was called to testify. I hadn't been sure if she'd actually go through with it, but when she took the stand, she didn't hold back. She confirmed that my dad had repeatedly told her and other family members that the shop would go to me. She also said she believed I was the one who truly cared about the business and had earned the right to run it. My dad looked visibly shocked, and my brother wouldn't even look at her. Things took another turn when my lawyer presented evidence of my brother's mismanagement. It came out that in the few months he'd been running the shop, he'd already mishandled funds, lost a couple of key clients, and even made decisions that led to delays in projects. My dad's lawyer tried to downplay it, but the damage was done. It was clear that my brother wasn't the savior of the business my dad had made him out to be. During a break, my dad's lawyer approached mine with a new settlement offer. It was significantly higher than the first one, but I still rejected it. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about accountability and standing up for myself. As the case went on, more locals started showing up in court. Their presence was a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. Seeing them there gave me a boost of confidence. The most dramatic moment came when my brother, clearly frustrated, had a meltdown during cross-examination. He accused me of trying to ruin his life and said I'd never be satisfied no matter what I got. His outburst didn't do him any favors, it only made him look petty and unprofessional. Finally, both sides presented their closing arguments. My lawyer emphasized my years of dedication and the promises that had been made, while my dad's lawyer tried to paint me as someone who was bitter and entitled. The judge announced that the verdict would be delivered in a few weeks, and the case was adjourned. As I left the courtroom, I felt a mix of emotions, but I knew I'd done everything I could to make my case. I posted an update on Reddit to thank everyone for their support and let them know how the day had gone. Now, all I can do is wait and see what the judge decides. No matter what happens, I'm proud that I stood up for myself. This fight isn't over yet. Update 4. The day of the verdict arrived and the courtroom was packed. My lawyer told me to stay calm no matter the outcome, but my hands felt like they were glued to the edge of the table. The judge took their time summarizing the arguments before delivering the decision. When they finally ruled in my favor, it was like time slowed down. The court awarded me significant compensation for my years of contributions to the shop. It wasn't ownership of the business, but it was a clear acknowledgement of the promises my dad had made and broken. As the judge finished speaking, my brother stormed out of the courtroom. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just grabbed his things and left. My dad stayed seated, looking stunned. After a few minutes, he came over to me and muttered an apology. It felt hollow, like he was saying it because he thought he had to, not because he truly meant it. I nodded politely but didn't engage. At that point, I wasn't interested in making amends. Too much had happened. Word of the verdict spread quickly in our small town, and it didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The shop started losing clients almost immediately. People didn't trust my brother to run the place, especially after the court proceedings revealed how poorly he'd managed things in just a few months. Longtime clients began taking their cars elsewhere, and my old coworkers weren't sticking around to watch the ship sink. One by one, they quit, citing the chaos and incompetence under my brother's leadership. At home, things weren't much better for my parents. My mom had been quietly supporting me throughout the case, but after the verdict, she reached her breaking point. She packed her bags and moved out, telling my dad she couldn't stay with someone who would treat their own child the way he had treated me. She came to stay with me for a while, and though things were tense, it was comforting to have her support. With the compensation money and the encouragement of my former coworkers, I decided it was time to start fresh. I announced that I was opening my own auto repair shop, and a few of my most trusted former coworkers immediately signed on to join me. It wasn't easy finding a location and getting everything set up, but the community rallied behind me. Locals started spreading the word, and before we'd even officially opened, we already had a list of clients ready to bring their cars in. Meanwhile, my dad started showing signs of regret. A cousin of mine told me he'd admitted privately that giving the business to my brother was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. It was too late, though. The damage was done, and I wasn't looking for reconciliation. My brother, on the other hand, seemed to spiral further. Without the shop bringing in consistent revenue, he couldn't keep up with his debts. He had to sell off some of his personal assets, and eventually the business shut down completely. The family was more divided than ever. Some relatives tried to pressure me into forgiving my dad and brother, saying that family is more important than money. I told them I wasn't holding a grudge, but I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine either. I decided to keep my distance, focusing on the new chapter 1 was building for myself. My mom, on the other hand, became my biggest cheerleader. She helped with everything from paperwork to decorating the new shop, and she even brought in some of her friends as our first clients. Seeing her support meant more to me than I could ever put into words. We started rebuilding our relationship, and I finally felt like I had someone in my corner. When the shop officially opened, it was one of the proudest moments of my life. We had a small ribbon-cutting ceremony, and some of our loyal clients from the old shop showed up to celebrate. I shared photos on Reddit, and the response was incredible. People from all over sent messages of support, saying how inspired they were by the journey I'd been through. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time. The betrayal from my dad and brother was devastating, but it pushed me to build something even better. Starting my own business wasn't part of the original plan, but it's given me a sense of independence and pride I wouldn't trade for anything. I owe a huge thanks to everyone who supported me through this, from my coworkers and community to the people on Reddit who kept me going when things felt hopeless. This fight wasn't easy, but it was worth it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes the people you trust the most will let you down, but that doesn't mean you can't pick yourself up and move forward. I'm excited to see where this new chapter takes me, and I'll always be grateful for the lessons this journey taught me. Thank you to everyone who's been part of this ride. I couldn't have done it without you. Update 5. Since opening my own shop, things have been moving fast. The grand opening turned out to be just the start of something much bigger than I expected. Within weeks, we were busy every single day. Loyal clients from the old shop kept coming back, and word of mouth brought in new customers who were eager to support a local business. We even had a few people tell us they came in because they'd read my story online. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. Then something unexpected happened. A former client from the old shop, someone I'd worked with closely for years, stopped by. After catching up and seeing how well the new business was running, they made me an offer. They wanted to invest in my shop to help us expand, offering not just financial backing but also connections to suppliers and equipment upgrades. It was a huge opportunity, and we started discussing plans almost immediately. Meanwhile, I started hearing more about my brother's struggles. His financial troubles had only gotten worse since the old shop shut down. He'd been forced to sell off his car and other personal assets, and I learned through a mutual acquaintance that he was living with my dad. The situation didn't surprise me, but it was still strange to think about how quickly things had unraveled for him. Out of the blue, I got an email from my dad. It was long, almost like he didn't know how to get to the point. He apologized for everything that had happened, said he regretted the decisions he'd made, and asked if there was any way we could repair our relationship. I didn't know how to respond right away. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't ready to let him back into my life either. Eventually, I sent a short reply thanking him for the apology and explaining that I needed time before considering any kind of reconciliation. Not long after, a local news outlet contacted me. They'd heard about my story from a client and wanted to feature my shop in an article. When the piece came out, it was titled something like "From Betrayal to Business Owner, the Face of Resilience." It was surreal seeing my name and photo in print, and it brought in even more customers. The community's support has been overwhelming in the best way. Then, my mom shared some news about my brother. She told me he'd had a complete breakdown, both financially and emotionally. He wasn't working, and my dad was now supporting him completely. I didn't know how to process it at first. I wasn't happy about it, but I couldn't say I was shocked either. My mom seemed worried about him, but she was also careful not to push me to reach out. The real curveball came when my dad showed up at my shop unannounced. He looked tired, older than I remembered. He started talking about how proud he was of what I'd accomplished and how sorry he was for everything. Then he made me an offer. He wanted to help me expand the shop, financially, logistically, however I needed. It sounded like his way of making up for the past, but I wasn't sure if I could trust him. My mom later told me she thought I should consider it, but warned me to make sure I stayed in control of my business. Before making any decisions, I consulted my lawyer. We discussed what an agreement with my dad might look like and how to structure it to protect my independence. The lawyer advised me to be cautious and suggested drafting a detailed contract if I decided to move forward. I appreciated the advice, but I still wasn't sure what to do. Around this time, one of my former coworkers who'd stayed at the old shop reached out to me. They shared details about how poorly my brother had run things before the business collapsed. It wasn't just bad decisions, it was sheer negligence. Hearing it all laid out made me feel a little better about how things had played out. At least I wasn't the reason the shop failed. Then came the biggest surprise. My brother texted me. He said he was desperate for work and asked if I'd consider hiring him as a mechanic. I didn't know what to think. On one hand, I knew how much he'd hurt me, but on the other, I couldn't ignore the fact that he was struggling. It was a lot to process, and I needed time to figure out what the right move was. In the end, I decided to meet with both my dad and my brother. We arranged to sit down in a neutral setting, a local coffee shop. I told them I was willing to hear them out, but I also made it clear that things wouldn't go back to how they were. Trust had to be earned, and boundaries had to be respected. My dad repeated his offer to help with the business, and my brother asked again for a job, saying he just needed a chance to start over. I haven't made any final decisions yet, but I'm leaning towards setting strict terms if I agree to anything. This is my business, my future, and I'm not going to let anyone jeopardize it again. I'll keep you all updated as things develop. For now, I'm just focused on keeping the momentum going and making the most of this new chapter in my life.